Hello, and you are very welcome to the first ever Teachers for Palestine YouTube video. Before we get into the video, let me tell you a little bit about ourselves. So, Teachers for Palestine is a group of teachers which initially was just in Ireland, and many of us had been to Palestine and were absolutely shocked at what we saw, both in the West Bank and some of us had been to Gaza, and absolutely horrified at what we witnessed. And I suppose the latest. Um, Mass murderous rampage that we're now witnessing on our screens in Gaza brought us together through various movements and going to protests. We bumped into each other and we discovered that we were teachers, and we decided we needed to do something about this in our schools, in our staff rooms, in Ireland once and for all. So we set up a group called Teachers for Palestine. Now, we have subsequently found out and reached out, and we found there's lots of groups around the world in schools in various different countries, from Canada to Australia, everywhere, also called Teachers for Palestine. So we're spreading our wings and we're beginning to link up with those. But this group here is from Ireland. So we've set ourselves a couple of goals. We've set ourselves a few goals, all right, in terms of the group and things that we would like to achieve and what we want to do. So obviously, one of the first goals is to add our voice of protest to stop the latest attack on Gaza. And of course, let's not forget, in the West Bank, still attacks happening in the West Bank. And of course, that's leading to the murder of tens of thousands of Palestinians. And we want to absolutely be at the forefront of one of those voices of opposition to that to try and help put an immediate stop to that. Secondly, we want to raise awareness and to educate people around the situation in Palestine, because talking to friends and colleagues in staff rooms, it's quite clear that people really don't understand the history of the region. They think it's just two countries, like equal entities, fighting each other, and a lot of times people have this idea that it's some religious war, because it's in the Middle East and it's off out there, and which we know, as we've been there, and people who have studied the region would know that it's not, absolutely not that there is a massive history there of ethnic cleansing, of settler colonialism. And so on. And we want to use our voice and our position as teachers to educate people about that. So that is one of the main goals of this group as well. And that is going on further beyond this current attack in Gaza and so on. We want to continue this on. We want to bring about curriculum change in our schools, because we've been talking, and literally the history of Palestine, it's not even in a lot of history books that we use in schools, and where it is, it's a mere paragraph or half a page, and it just describes the usual conflict, and it never mentions ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, never mentions the history of the region in our history book. So we've set a mission ourselves to try to change that and to introduce the actual history of the region into our schools, so people, when they leave school in future generations, will be far better educated than our current generation are on the situation there. So that is another one of our main goals. We also want to, because when many of us who'd been to Palestine, we fell in love with the culture, with the people, how friendly they were. It's just an amazing, amazing, rich culture in Palestine. And we want to set up cultural exchanges between our schools and the schools in Palestine. And we can do that through twinning up of schools, where they would, be pen pals with people, with the students in school in both countries, could be pen pals. We would have Zoom links like this one, where the classes could Zoom into each other, set each other challenges. You learn a bit of the Irish language, we learn a bit of Arabic, you learn some of the Irish sports, we learn some Irish sports, and we can even get the schools involved in competitions with each other, etc., all through Zoom, and so on. And hopefully down the line, as things improve, we could even have tours, school tours, where schools from both Palestine and Ireland could interact with each other. And of course, that's just sticking with our little group in Ireland. Obviously, we would love to take this internationally, where Teachers for Palestine groups all around the world can link up, and we can begin to work on those links with schools in Palestine. Okay, so that's just, we've a lot more goals, but that's just a flavor of some of what we want to try and do with this group. So back to this lecture series. So what is it? Well, again, from talking to people in our staff rooms, it was quite clear that people didn't really understand the situation on the ground and what's happening. Didn't understand the history of settler colonialism. Didn't understand the whole ethnic cleansing that had happened, the Nakba. Most people never heard of that. They just thought it was a conflict and it was religious based, and that's it. And it's terrible and it's awful, but they didn't really understand the depth of it, and hence why uh, people were inclined not to speak out because they didn't know anything about it, because knowledge is power. So we decided we wanted to run a series of educational. Well, it started off with just one. Let's bring a historian in and let them talk about the history of Palestine. But that's far too long history to try and condense in for a historian to do, because they would have every single detail of everything. So what we decided to do was to turn it into a series of lectures. So we're going to make this a series, however long it takes. Then we decided, you know what, we're going to do interviews with people as well, people from Palestine, people from Ireland who had been there, teachers, students. So we're going to use YouTube as a vehicle to do a lot of that. But our very first one tonight, a history teacher, Conall, I'm going to bring him in a second, Conall O'Dufaigh, is going to come in and he's going to give us a kind of bring us up to speed on where we are at right now. So we're going to zoom through on Zoom the history of Palestine from the very beginning to where we are now in an hour. And it's just going to be kind of like a history 101. And then after that, in subsequent episodes, we are going to delve into different periods in time in Palestine. So, for example, we could zoom in on specifically the Nakba and what happened there. We could zoom in on the March of Return in 2018 in Gaza and what happened in detail there. And we can zoom in on aspects as well. So settler colonialism, what is it? How is it evident in Palestine, etc., and so on. So we're going to zoom into all these periods and aspects of the history of Palestine over the next number of weeks, months, and years on this YouTube channel. But very first, just to kick it off, we're going to go through, just to bring people up to speed, because we feel it's important at the moment that people are brought up to speed quickly, because we want to get as many people protesting what's happening at the moment. And to do that, you need knowledge, you need to understand. Well, you don't actually, you just need to see the images on your screen. But some people are afraid to speak out because of comeback of people saying, don't you know this is that and this is this and so on. So we want to arm people with the correct knowledge of the situation. So that's what this is. So look, I'll be quiet now, and I'm going to bring in on Zoom our expert for the lesson is a history teacher, Conall O'Dufaigh, and he's going to give us a history 101 of Palestine over the next hour or so. So, Conall, I'll bring you in there, and you can introduce yourself to the audience and let them know who you are.
Hey everyone, my name is Conall. Apologies if my voice is a little bit off. I tested positive for COVID earlier today, but I reckon we'll be grand. So, one of the main reasons for calling this talk in the first place is just people who can obviously see what's happening in the news are horrified by it, but feel a little bit intimidated to talk about it. And just ultimately, it's quite simple. It's a settler colonial project. You can sum that up and all of the horrors that go with it in a couple of sentences. But just so that when people do get into the nitty gritty of the various cases that are argued against the rights of Palestinians and stuff like that, just that we have that context, that we know the examples that might be kind of used and stuff like that, and also just to talk about the experiences of Palestinians and why this came to be. And to be honest, I think a great place to start this is actually not in the Middle East, but in Europe, which is where I'm going to go now once I share my screen. Let's just share the main screen and go full screen on the slides. Now, that's a bit of my Twitter feed. Now, slideshow from the beginning. Okay, so this is a map of Europe, a satirical map made by the Dutch in around 1870, and it just gives a little bit of context for where Europe was at this point. We have quite a different map from what we're used to today. You can see, I don't know if my mouse is visible to you or not, but a newly reunified German Empire bordering on the Russian Empire underneath their Catholic rivals in Austria, and so on. Obviously, those empires gradually started to break up over the next half a century or so. And around this point is when you started to get emerging movements for, nationalism. So obviously in Ireland, we're quite familiar with the fact that that was happening here, particularly at that point with, the Fenians and Parnell's, constitutional movement. Also the Hungarians and so on. Another group who was in a very difficult situation was Europe's population of Jews, who throughout the Middle Ages had been treated horrifically. There's no other way of looking at it other than that. And around the 1890s, some of them started to question, why shouldn't they have a homeland of their own in the same way? So just to look at the origins of what was happening around 1894 to 1906, you have the Dreyfus affair in France, where Captain Alfred Dreyfus from the military was accused of treason. The trial dragged on for a long time. It was riddled with anti-Semitism. He was sentenced to hard labor in the colonies. I think it was the Caribbean somewhere. Years later, evidence emerged that showed that some other guy had been the traitor, and yes, there was still a long hesitancy to release Dreyfus, which was fueled very much by hatred of Jews. So around this time, while this is happening, a group of Jewish secular, at the time, the Zionism began as a very secular movement, activists got together. They held the first Zionist Congress. Most influential figure at this point is Theodor Herzl, who you can see right at the very top between the two other delegates. Below you have the actual Congress itself, which met in Basel in Switzerland. And at this point, they decided on the necessity of a Jewish homeland so that they wouldn't have to be a minority in any other country. At this point, they weren't exactly settled on where that homeland should be. As I said, they weren't a religious group. The idea of Palestine was tossed out, and they were calling it Palestine at this point, as everyone was. But also places like Alaska were discussed. They wanted somewhere remote where they could set up and have their own state. And they fundamentally, even when they discussed Palestine, believed that it was a state which was empty. At this point, many of them still believed the statement that very much has been exposed as a lie now, that this new homeland would be a land without a people for a people without a land. So in the late 19th century, European Jews did start to relocate and move to Palestine, as it was known then. This actually quite gorgeous poster you'll sometimes see pro-Palestinian activists have in their houses and stuff. Yeah, around this time you do start to get the first transfer of European Jews who go to Palestine, in many cases not anticipating this as like a major colonial movement. Some of them did, some of them very much did, I'll get to that soon, but some of them believed that they were immigrating to a place where they were safe, where there wasn't the same history of violence against Jews. It should also be pointed out that there was a population of Jewish people living here all through ancient times in the Middle Ages. They enjoyed a peaceful enough life. They also initially resented these new Jewish people who were arriving with a different kind of an ideological standpoint to them, that they wanted to fundamentally change the land. In 1907, the first armed group is set up. They are called Bar Gayora. I'm definitely mispronouncing that. But named after a leader of the uprising against the Romans in 79 AD, which historically is when the Jewish diaspora began and Jewish people were, in the narrative, were kicked out of Israel. Now, what we understand in modern history about when massive population movements like that supposedly happened, we don't necessarily believe all of the Visigoths left Eastern Europe and all went to Italy and then all settled in Spain. There were trains of people and groups of people and armies with, their families and, artisans and stuff traveling with them. And it's a similar pattern here. A lot of those people remained there and still do. So while it is genuinely impressive how many Jewish people around the world can trace their DNA to a common ancestry in Palestine. The same is absolutely true of Palestinians, because of course it is. But I think more to the point again is that neither biblical texts nor DNA should be used as the center point for your political ideology, I would argue. Now, we're going to jump ahead to the First World War, and don't worry, I'm not getting into the First World War in any detail. Just to say that in 1916, before the fall of the Ottoman Empire, so at this point, the region of Palestine fell under the rule of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. They were fighting on the same side as Germany and Austria during the First World War, and Britain and France got together in 1916 to make plans for what they would do with the lands they were about to conquer once that empire fell. So they this guy Sykes and Picot got together and came up with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, cleverly named. But as you can see in this map here, we have, what is now Israel-Palestine in yellow down here, and then a line directly across, more or less where the border with Lebanon is today, and then cutting across the Middle East. This was essentially how they planned to, and ultimately did, execute the carving up of the Middle East into the shape that it's in today. Which has, not to get into it in too many areas, but you can look at the countries like Iraq, countries like Lebanon, which were heavily affected by decisions made by France and Britain at this point. Another major thing that emerged at the end of the First World War was the Balfour Declaration, where the British government committed that the land that was now under their control, Palestine became known as British Mandate Palestine. They committed that eventually it would be made into a Jewish state. So at this point, there isn't really a discussion about, some utopian kind of coming together of two peoples in this land. It was going to definitively be a colonial project. But that, at this point, was a promise, not, something actively enacted, although Jewish immigration from Europe increased as, the Zionist movement back in Europe were lobbying politicians and political leaders and essentially making the argument that, you don't want us on your golf courses. What if we were out in the Middle East? We're gone out of your hair, and then you also have a regional ally of people who are basically European. Something that is kind of very prescient in terms of, the modern movement that exists today, where, the likes of Netanyahu is more than happy to ally with, Christian Zionists in the USA who are essentially anti-Semitic and want Jews in that region for the apocalypse, or people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, another avowed anti-Semite. Pushing on, it's worth mentioning as well that, this country of Palestine has been around a long time and was a very interesting and ethnically diverse place long before this conflict came along. So around the time that the British took charge, you had majority Arab-speaking Muslims of the population. About 11% of Palestinians were Jewish at this point, and also other identities such as, Christians, some of them Egyptian Coptic Christians or Palestinian Egyptian Coptic Christians, but Druze, Africans, etc. There's a lovely picture here of Christian boys gathering in I think it's the Jerusalem YMCA in 1938. So just to show that there was that diversity. Over time, the Christian population in Palestine has declined. A big part of that is that demographically they tended to be a bit better off than the Muslims in the whole. So when the push factors of occupation and of colonization were increased gradually, they were the ones who were in a better position to leave. Doing a real speed run through 150 years of history, so apologies for that. Then we come to the Nakba. Nakba is the Arabic word for catastrophe. Palestinians consider the Nakba as what began in 1948 with the foundation of the State of Israel, the ethnic cleansing of many Palestinian towns and villages, and also that it's a process that's continuing to this day. It's an ongoing catastrophe. So following World War II, another major instance of Europeans horrifically treating Jews and the Holocaust was one of the greatest stains on the history of humankind. But a lot of very traumatized Jewish Holocaust survivors start to arrive in Mandate Palestine. And this really kind of kicks tensions up several notches. The Haganah, the political descendants of Bar Giora, start to wage a guerrilla war against the British occupiers of Palestine in order to have a Jewish state established. Very famously, they bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. Ironically, when Rishi Sunak recently visited Israel, he was put up in that same hotel. I don't know what historical irony that is, but that is the case. There were a lot of British soldiers and officials killed in that bombing. Eventually, in 1947, the UN creates a partition plan, which will create two new states in British Mandate Palestine. One will be a Palestinian state, which you can see here in orange, covering a larger section than the West Bank and Gaza, but extending down into the Nakab Desert, as well as a section in the north bordering Lebanon. And then the blue state was to be future Israel. The Zionist movement accepted this plan. The Palestinians did not. This is something that's often used as an example of, those unreasonable Arabs. They never wanted to negotiate. They had no interest in peace. I think if you look at it from the Palestinian perspective, there's no possible way they could have accepted this. That blue region makes up 60% of historic Palestine. They, as the natives, were going to be given 40% to remain living on. It was just, it wasn't a viable offer ever to begin with. So naturally tensions continued to escalate. In 1948, the following year, Israel declared its independence. So we can see the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, standing in the center there, and above him, Theodor Herzl, who we met earlier at the first Zionist Congress. Just to jump back a little bit, I'm sure you've all seen this map, but this is the first, I suppose, two plans, or the first two maps relevant to our last slide there. So Jewish settlements as of 1946, the proposed plan, and how much land was to be handed over. As I said, it wasn't viable. Then afterwards we get the territory that's seized after the war. So I'll come to that soon. So in 1948, Israel is David Ben-Gurion issues Israel's Declaration of Independence. The following day, the neighboring Arab countries invade. This is what's termed as Israel's War of Independence, and by Palestinians, the Nakba. First off, although Israel was fighting several other countries, there was no question that they were going to win. They were far better supplied than Egypt or Jordan or any of these countries, and they had also been preparing for it for some time. Another thing that happens during this time is the forced expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians from their homes. One of the lightning rods that facilitated this was the town of Deir Yassan, where the Israeli militants came in and killed, I believe it was 107 Palestinian villagers, including women and children. After that, the Palestinians who were willing to stand their ground in their villages decreased. People started to move to stay alive, but also genuinely believing that they would be able to come back. You have the powerful symbol that Palestinians have of the key, and that essentially means we left our homes, but we kept the key so that we can go back. They also keep the deeds to the houses they used to live in. Now, of those 700,000 refugees, many of them ended up in Gaza, which was now under Egyptian rule, or the West Bank, which is now under Jordanian rule. But many of them also remained within what became the borders of Israel. So today, 1 in 5 Israelis is a Palestinian citizen of Israel. They are still subject to an apartheid system where they're second-class citizens. You have the Bedouin in the Nakab, fighting to retain their lands. You have even people just trying to move back to the village where their grandparents were expelled from, and town councils being able to overrule them because the village has to maintain its Jewish character. Moving on into the years after Israel has been established. This is a beautiful photo of Gaza in the 1950s. It's nice to just see Gaza in another light sometimes. So West Bank and Gaza are now under the occupation of Jordan and Egypt. So there is no Palestinian state. Israel is kind of playing a bit of a charm offensive around the world. They start to do things like, grow forests and name them after, I think there's a forest named after Eamon de Valera in Israel. I believe there's another one named after John F. Kennedy. Unfortunately, some of these forests were literally grown on the ruins of Palestinian villages. So there's this erasure of the Palestinian history in the land. There was another village, just in a particularly galling, ironic example. There's a Palestinian village I believe it's in Jerusalem, which has been completely leveled and turned into a car park for a Holocaust museum. Israel starts to ally itself with, Western powers such as France, the UK, America. Notably during the Suez Crisis in the 1950s, they seize territory in Egypt. And interestingly, because this wouldn't be something we'd anticipate happening now, it was America that stepped in and kind of told France, England, and Israel that they had to back off, and they did. So we have this state of affairs where there's this new reality which Palestinians are forced to live under, and the Israeli foundational years are underway until we reached the 1967 Six-Day War. So tensions had continued to build between Israel and its neighboring Arab states, particularly opposing Nasser, who was premier of Egypt in these years. I don't want to get too far into the geopolitics of that, because personally I think the focus of this should be on Palestinians and their experiences. But suffice to say, similar to 1948, there was never really a chance that Israel was going to lose this war. They launched a preemptive strike on the Egyptian Air Force and totaled it right at the beginning, and then their armies were able to roll out very quickly. In terms of the experiences of Palestinians, they then seized the territory which Jordan and Egypt had held since 1948. And this is where you get to the period described as the occupation. The occupation begins in 1967, as opposed to the Nakba, which is earlier. So this is an image that is celebrated in Israel, and from a cultural point of view, it's them coming back to the Mount in Jerusalem and reclaiming their ancestral homeland. Trouble is, there were people living there. So that's the Al-Quds Mosque, which says a lot in itself in terms of how this land is a very shared legacy. And we can see here the territory that was claimed. So we have the West Bank, which is now under Israeli rule. Gaza here, same thing, under occupation. The Golan Heights, in land which is taken from Syria, which still remains under occupation by Israel and under similar circumstances to the West Bank and Gaza. In addition to this, Israel seized the Sinai Peninsula, historically where, in the Bible, where Moses wandered for 80 years, but Egyptian territory. And in all of these regions, they quite quickly started to build settlements. So under international law, an occupying army is supposed to, in theory, safeguard the ground that they've conquered and then give it up, set up a viable government and then go away. But when you start building settlements, you're annexing, you're claiming land for yourself, which is, as I said, what they immediately started to do. So all of that territory remains with Israel, with the exception of the Sinai Peninsula, which went back to Egypt as part of the peace deal in the late 70s and early 80s. All the settlements they built there were dismantled to make sure that the Egyptians couldn't, make use of those buildings. Anything else I wanted to cover here? That's that for that slide. Another major thing that happens post 1967 is that Palestinians start to really make a mark on the international stage as a force unto themselves and as a movement unto themselves and a people unto themselves. So the Palestinian Liberation Organization was founded in 1964, 3 years before the war, as an umbrella group of lots of militant, but also of militant groups and political parties focused on the liberation of Palestine. They start to refer to Israel as the state of Israel for the first time, rather than terms like the Zionist entity that you'll still hear some Arab states talk about. Essentially, this was Palestinians beginning to claim their own role and their own in the betterment of their own situation, rather than relying on the international community to do it for them. This is also where, in the Western world, people first start to realize that the Palestinians are being mistreated, because that news wasn't really getting out up until now. There's a quote that's often tossed around by Martin Luther King where he speaks fondly of Israel. Now, there is some speculation over whether or not he said it, but if he did, fair enough. It was said at a private dinner, and it's kind of a little bit it's a little bit kind of murky. But by the end of his life, which was post 1967, he was able to speak critically and in favor of the rights of Palestinians. But that's just to point out that there's this transition in the late 60s where people just didn't really know about the plight of Palestinians before then in a lot of the world. There was no internet. There was a particular story coming out about, oh, it's great the Jews finally have their homeland. And that bit of the narrative was just missing. So through the 1970s, to be fair, like guerrilla warfare is quite brutal. Palestinians start to fight back militantly. You start to get things like plane hijackings, mostly organized by the PFLP in this era, as well as it's like the IRA in Ireland. It was a brutal period, but also it's worth noting that at this point it's still quite a secular movement. People forget that the Islamism hadn't really taken off in the Middle East at this point. Tensions continue to rise. The PLO was largely driven out of the Palestinian territories, and its headquarters moved from Jordan to Lebanon, and ultimately, eventually, to I think Tunisia. They ended up in the late 80s. But back at home, regular Palestinians under years of occupation rise up in a popular uprising. There's huge protests, riots, goes on for 6 years, from 1987 to 1993. Yitzhak Rabin, Israeli prime minister, had this policy called the broken bone policy of, try to capture rioters and break their bones so that you, as a way of quelling the protest and scaring people to protest. But it had an effect, because it finally brought Israel to the table. Now, I'm sure there was some international pressure as well at this point, but that's goes to show there was this kind of lightning rod effect of 1967 and how it extended up over the decades. So while similar to in Ireland, the IRA and Britain finally agreed to go into talks, the PLO and the Israeli government did as well. So you have this very historic moment from 1993 where you've Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, a very seminal figure in Palestinian history, a bit like the Palestinian Jerry Adams, with all the in some places adoration, in some places controversies, everything that comes with it, but this is as I said, a very poignant moment, and a moment that to the rest of the world and to Palestinians and Israelis felt like a potential positive ending to this conflict. This would have allowed for, if the talks had been successful, there would have been a Palestinian state. Palestine would have now been occupying 20% of historic Palestine, so it was still not a great deal. But I think there was a historic window there where Palestinians were willing to accept this. But right off the ground, the peace talks start to run into problems. Not least of which, just personal opinion, I think Bill Clinton as American president, possibly not the most impartial person to be a broker of peace. But I suppose more prominently than that, Yitzhak Rabin, who I criticized in the last slide, but is engaging in a peace process at this point. He is soon assassinated later that year by the far right in Israel. It should be pointed out that current Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was virulently opposed to Rabin's peace efforts, although I don't necessarily want to let the liberal end of the Israeli political system off the hook either. We'll come to that a little bit later. Another possibly greater obstacle to peace is that while the cameras were on the peace talks, the meetings in Oslo and Camp David, on the ground for Palestinians, the number of settlements increased, I think, threefold. So while supposedly a plan is being put together to create a viable Palestinian state, if you're a Palestinian, you see that they're ramping up their efforts to seize your territory as fast as possible, but while these peace talks are going on. So the possibility of there being a Palestinian state in the West Bank or Gaza, when it's riddled with settlements, with towns that only Jewish people can enter, with roads that only Jewish people can use, that is directly contrary to what you're seeing. And it also opens up a space for a group I haven't mentioned until now, Hamas. So Hamas, they're quite a radical Islamist group. They emerged in the 1980s. The Israeli historian, and I'm citing my sources on this one because it's a controversial point, Ronan Bergman, who is I wouldn't quite call him a supporter of Palestine at all. He's willing to be somewhat critical of the Israeli government. But in his research, he points to Israeli intelligence's policy of basically favoring Hamas and arranging things so that Hamas can kind of benefit and grow as an organization to act as an internal Palestinian opposition to the PLO and to Fatah, Yasser Arafat's political party. Also, they are not as palatable on the world stage to Westerners. And, when peace talks reach any kind of a crunching point, Israel can exert pressure on Yasser Arafat and the PLO to crush Hamas. And in a sense, basically blackmailing them into starting a Palestinian civil war in order to have a successful peace agreement. So through the 90s, you start to see Yasser Arafat, Fatah, and the PLO lose a lot of support among Palestinians, which lays the groundwork for, for the future, I suppose, decline of Fatah and ultimately the split between the West Bank and Gaza. So these tensions first come to a head with the new millennium as the second intifada breaks out. So much like the first intifada, you have a popular uprising, you have protests, you have riots, you have violence, but also very, very, very harsh repression by the Israeli state. This continues for a number of years until we start to see a few particular developments emerge, which I will discuss now. So I made a little section called 2004 to 2007 because I think there's a couple of sea change moments in the history of this conflict that happened just in this kind of short space of 3 years. So the first one is a major international win for Palestinians. The International Court of Justice rules that Israel's separation wall, I put that in quotation marks, is illegal. So Israel started constructing this wall, arguing that it was for defense, to defend Israeli settlements and Israel proper, I suppose if you call it that, the pre-1967 borders from attacks by Palestinians. The thing is, though, and we'll see this when we look in a bit more detail, it's actually quite cleverly put together in a way that it can facilitate annexing Palestinian land. So it doesn't quite go along the border with the West Bank. It kind of cuts deep into the West Bank in many places. In addition, roads crisscrossing and stuff like that. There's not a viable system or a state there. So this is ruled to be illegal. And Palestinians waited with bated breath for Israel to have to start taking it down. Unfortunately, this ruling was not enforced. So once again, Palestinians are left to realize that, the end to their situation is not going to come from the international community. It is not going to come from any appeal to international law. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they stopped appealing to international law, but a few new developments come about. One, which I'm very enthusiastic about, was in 2005. A lot of Palestinian civil society organizations came together. So you have, businesses, NGOs, trade unions, to call for a campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until such time as it complies with international law. This was modeled on the ultimately successful similar campaign called for by South Africans, or Black South Africans, to end the apartheid regime there. Now, by 2005, apartheid is not just, the Afrikaans word for a racist regime. Apartheid has been codified into international law as a crime. So it is a very specific accusation that's being made. There is inspiration from South Africa, but some people, you'll sometimes hear the argument that, like, oh, they'll try to bog you down in the differences between South Africa and Palestine. There are loads of differences, but that's not the point. The point is that this is a crime that we can kind of put specific parameters on. Another development, actually, I put 1 point in between my 2 points. I'll just jump ahead to 06 for a second. Another development is Hamas's election victory in 2006. To the international community, this was unexpected. If you've been paying attention and sort of seeing, the gradual decline in popularity of the PLO, and it's not to say that they're gone. It's not to say that there isn't support for them yet. But there's certainly a lot of criticism and a lot of disillusionment, and people turn towards Hamas, who, if nothing else, were certainly going to fight Israel, often with very, brutal methods. But it's worth pointing out as well that Hamas won the election with a slogan of a generation's peace with Israel. So there was no immediate plan to kind of continue the offensives of the Second Intifada or anything like that. In 2005, Ariel Sharon, Israel's prime minister, withdraws Israel's settlements in Gaza. So something, again, that's often kind of cited as like a very magnanimous gesture by Israel. You could say they shouldn't have been there in the first place, which under international law is the case. But also, Israel isn't that interested in Gaza. The settlers who lived there were furious about it, and some of the hard right wing of Israel were furious about it. Sharon's support came more from the center and a little bit left of center, although he had a track record of very much brutality against Palestinians and the Lebanese as well during the 1980s. But I think this was very much a tactical, calculated decision. It would look good to the international community, and also, as I said, Israel wasn't that interested in it. There's no real historical record of the Jewish people or any ancient kingdom of Judea or anything like that being located in Gaza, as opposed to the West Bank, where the kingdoms of Judea and Samaria were. You'll often hear Israelis refer to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. Now we get really complicated. So post-election, Hamas and Fatah come up with a power-sharing agreement. So there's a very uneasy peace between these two factions. It lasts for a year and a half, and ultimately it collapses in an event known as the Battle of Gaza. There's different accounts of what happened. One thing that is very much known is that America had a hand in it. As best as we can make out, the American intelligence, CIA, got in touch with a policeman who was part of a Fatah kind of contingent of police in Gaza, and basically put him up to launching a coup d'etat against the Hamas members of government. Hamas learned of this ahead of time and struck first. So you have this quite brutal kind of battle of Palestinians against Palestinians, facilitated, in many ways by Israel's policy of promoting Hamas in the 80s, America's kind of pushing Fatah, or pushing a small faction of Fatah. I want to be very clear, this is not a Fatah act that planned assassination. But fundamentally after that, Hamas and Fatah are split. And as a result, so are Gaza and the West Bank. The West Bank will remain trying to enact the peace agreement, or the peace agreements that have existed with Israel. We'll get to those in a bit more detail quite soon. And Gaza is under the control of Hamas. Now, Gaza remains occupied, and I'll come to how that is true in a little while. But nominally, the government is a Hamas government. It's also worth pointing out that in this era, two of the big heavyweights of Palestinian and Israeli politics are, exit the scene. Yasser Arafat dies, and also Ariel Sharon enters a coma from which he doesn't wake up, and I think he passes away in 2014. So just to talk a little bit about life in the West Bank in the years since 2007. So here is a map of the West Bank as it currently exists, or did in 2020. As you can see, while this is nominally Palestinian territory, you can see a lot of little lines and sections cordoned off. Basically, it is broken up into a system of roads and walls and barriers between Israeli settlements, and Palestinians are kind of restricted in their movements, even for basic things such as, farmers getting to their land or workers being able to go to their jobs. There's cases of pregnant women trying to get through checkpoints and miscarrying before they're allowed through. So there's quite a brutal system there. What's the name of that guy? The Egyptian comedian. Left my name now. He was on Piers Morgan a few weeks ago, but he made a very excellent point, which is that try to imagine how this conflict would work if Hamas wasn't there. And I was like, well, we don't have to imagine. We can look at the West Bank. Hamas is not in the West Bank, and Palestinians are still step by step facing this kind of slow extinction, where there's a gradual policy of making life as miserable as it can be in an effort to push emigration so that enough of them will leave. So there's a certain areas with devolved government, like say around the city of Ramallah, and also the presence of settlements all over the West Bank. Settlements continue to expand. You also have this what many of us would call Bantustans. This is a term borrowed from South Africa in the waning years of the apartheid regime there. They started to say, oh no, we're not racist. We're not trying to oppress blacks. Look, we'll grant territory. So they started setting up these sort of puppet governments and puppet states where they could say, like, this is we don't rule this. This is black territory. And in a similar sense here, you have the West Bank being gradually broken up into small Palestinian enclaves between settlements. So as an example, I wanted to look at Kalkilia here, a town in the West Bank, or city in the West Bank, which you can see from this map, which I haven't credited because I just stole it off. I screenshot it from Google Earth earlier today. Is walled around entirely, except for one checkpoint controlled by Israel in and out of the city. So it's quite this dystopian image of, if you live in the city, if you walk to the edge of it, you see a big wall erected by Israel. There's only one way in or out. And your ability to leave or to re-enter is completely at Israel's discretion. Should be pointed out as well that although there is limited, autonomous government in the West Bank given to Palestinians, they they can elect politicians, they have their own police force, etc., some infrastructure. Israel still holds a lot of sway over that. So, for example, Israel can withhold their tax revenue. The tax is collected by Israel. Israel can just say, yeah, you're not getting it if you're not towing the line. And something else I'd like to point to is the role and the agency of Palestinians and Palestinian resistance. You'll often hear about Palestinian resistance as though it's like it equals terrorism and stuff like that. Some Palestinians facing these circumstances have turned towards desperate means and violent means. That's true, but there are also many cases of other types of resistance. So the picture here is Bassam Abu Rama, an activist from the town of Bil'in, where himself and a few people from the area started the Friday protest movement. So this is weekly non-violent protests where villagers and Palestinians will march up to the checkpoints and to where the wall is being constructed, either to get to their land, to try and farm or whatever, or to their olive, to the olive trees, to harvest olives, whatever the task is, or even just to demonstrate that they want to march through the checkpoint or march up to the wall. They're quite often met with fairly brutal repression. Bassam himself was killed in 2009 with a it was a tear gas grenade. So in, fashion as we'll sometimes see. There's another example later on of using something that's nominally a non-lethal weapon, but in a lethal way, so that you can kind of hide behind it. This is a practice that has been happening consistently in the West Bank and Gaza. So tear gas canister is supposed to be fired into the air so that it kind of doesn't arc and then lands down, so it won't have the same velocity. The tear gas canister which killed Bassam Abu Rama was fired directly at his chest. So it was an act of murder. But the movement that began with himself and people like Iyad Bernat, Emmett Bernat continued to grow. You'll see actually the initial movement in Bil'in is documented in the Oscar nominated, might have actually won the Oscar, I'm not sure, movie Five Broken Cameras, filmed by Emmett Bernat, who was an activist and a filmmaker from Bil'in. He's actually a member of the Academy now. I love that it's no compensation for living under occupation, but this Palestinian activist from Bil'in has a vote in the Oscars every year, which is well deserved. It's a fantastic film. I strongly recommend watching it. Here's another example of a fence protest. I love this one. This is from early 2010 when the movie Avatar was, a big international hit. So it's a load of Palestinian activists dressed up as the Na'vi, using the fact that it's fun, but it's also using the fact that the movie is very much a metaphor for resistance against colonization. So they marched up to the fence that day, dressed as Na'vi. Unsurprisingly, they were tear gassed when they got there, but they continue with this movement and with their protests, to their credit. Now we move on to Gaza. So as bad as things are in the West Bank, they are considerably worse in Gaza. So while technically you don't have Israeli troops patrolling around in Gaza, well, until a few weeks ago, Israel from 2007 retained full control of, air, land, and sea access to Gaza, bar the Rafah crossing with Egypt. So Gaza is a beautiful coastal region. Gaza City should be this, beautiful tourist resort, but instead, it's kind of been starved from 2007 onwards. Dov Weissglass, an Israeli minister at the time, claimed that, oh no, we're not starving Palestinians, we're putting them on a diet. So they were already enacting this collective punishment for how they voted. So food was being restricted. You also have the fact that off this coast into the Mediterranean, it's a coastal town. A large part of it would have been reliant on fishing as an industry, or just ultimately as the siege continues, just as a source of food. Palestinian fishing boats are not allowed more than 3 miles off the coast of Gaza. Gaza used to have an airport that has long since been put out of action. You also, in the wall surrounding Gaza, have what's kind of Israel brought in an exclusion zone. They brought it in on the Palestinian side, obviously, where they have kind of unmanned robotic gun turrets, kind of, being powered from miles away, being used to sort of monitor any Palestinian farmers who might get too close to the wall. So, and also we'll talk about incursions in a little while, but when destruction happens in Gaza, Israel created this term of a dual use item. So any kind of aid that comes in, particularly for like reconstruction or anything like that, that is deemed that, oh, this could have a purpose, for a Hamas military venture, it is often restricted. And the term is so vague, dual use item, that ultimately you can kind of judge anything to be a dual use item. They were going back to this recently. That weird admiral who's doing the videos on YouTube has look at these Hamas tunnels, has talked about like, oh, they get aid and they use it to build tunnels, but like they're fundamentally preventing so much of this aid from getting in. So you have things like it's a misnomer to think that there's huge amounts of aid going into Gaza when so much of it is restricted. So like buildings that get destroyed can't be repaired a lot of the time. Sewerage that has been sewerage lines that have been blown up can't be repaired either. So you kind of have this pollution of like sewerage into drinking water and stuff like that. Ben Shapiro's very racist comment about how Palestinians love to live in sewerage. They don't. That is something that was enforced on them. So under any, understanding of international law, Israel retains full control of this area in any meaningful way. So yes, it is still occupied, and it is still considered part of the occupied Palestinian territories by the UN, and that it's fundamentally the case. This is what happens when I talk for too long before I click on to the next slide. So one of the first bits of international solidarity with Gaza following the beginning of the siege was the arranging of aid flotillas. There's a practical use to it of actually bringing in, food, medical supplies, construction material, whatever they could bring on boats, and to kind of sail along and kind of dare the Israeli Navy to prevent these humanitarian missions. It also has the massive symbolic power of breaking the siege. That tactic gradually kind of wore out. There was cases of, bits of sabotage to boats. I believe the very last Irish boat to go over was sabotaged before. Now they were able to repair it, but it was sabotaged before taking off from Greece, I think. But also, I think more than anything else, you have 2010 when when a flotilla of boats, including a boat with Irish people on board, were intercepted by the Israeli Navy. Now, I remember talking to, I think it was Fintan Lane, or shortly afterwards, who was on the Challenger. One of the boats said that, like, the boats with white people on them thought it was a good idea to kind of place themselves around the Turkish boat, the Mavi Marmara, because they figured if they were to be intercepted and if harm was to come to people, it would most likely be the Turkish group who would be targeted. And indeed they were. A number of the Turkish activists were killed. There was an Irish boat which had been held up in Cyprus for repairs. They, after this interception, very, very bravely decided to keep sailing on to Gaza. They too were intercepted a week later. I don't know if anyone here was at the Israeli embassy that night. There was a protest. We held a vigil outside and stayed there all night, and it ultimately turned into a blockade of the embassy. So the Israeli embassy was shut that following Friday morning. So afterwards, another flotilla was arranged for the following year, and that was the last one as far as I'm aware. So it was a powerful symbolic tactic. It also had a very humanitarian goal to it, but ultimately it was it met the force of the Israeli military, and that kind of brought an end to it. That's a picture of the Mavi Marmara. Next, we have Israeli incursions into Gaza. On the 27th of December, 2008, Israel began a bombardment of Gaza. As it was reported in the news at the time, it was the case being made was that Hamas, refused to renew their peace treaty with Israel. The reality was a little bit different. Hamas, I think I've made the case beforehand. I don't mean to weigh in on Palestinian internal politics, but at the same time, I'm not a massive fan of them as an organization. Their values are not necessarily mine. But one thing I will say for them, just even from a pragmatic point of view, they're usually they have a better record of adhering to peace agreements than Israel does, because it would be suicidal not to have. So in March, I think it was, a peace agreement was made between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. In early November, very sneakily, on the day that Obama was elected president, Israel launched a number of airstrikes, killing a few senior Hamas officials. So Hamas didn't retaliate and break the peace treaty, but when that peace treaty came to its natural end, they said they weren't going to renew it, and in response, Israel launched an attack into Gaza. Hamas started firing Qassam rockets out into southern Israel. Interestingly, the residents of Sderot, one of the towns that kind of bears the brunt of these attacks when they come, I think it was 500 residents of that town signed a petition blaming the Israeli government for the Qassam rockets they were facing. It's worth making a point, which I'll come to quite soon, that some of these rockets are indiscriminate attacks into Israel. There's no question about that. And now, as I also pointed out, there's very few quote unquote legitimate Israeli targets that can be attacked from Gaza. They kind of exist as this almost robotic presence. There are drones flying overhead, there are unmanned gun turrets, and so on. So if people are going to turn to violence, they're going to put these things together and throw them over the wall. Many of the Qassam rockets are not capable of killing people. And also Israel has the Iron Dome defense system, which is one of the most sophisticated missile defense systems on Earth, so that most of the rockets are also intercepted. But yes, some do reach, towns and homes and do kill Israeli civilians. That is true. That is not something that we're going to, pretend is not the case. But it is worth pointing out that there's a massive disparity in loss of life between Palestinians and Israelis in this regard. So I just thought it'd be important to run through a couple of figures on this. So in Operation Cast Lead, 3 Israeli civilians were killed and 10 Israeli soldiers. On the Palestinian side, 900 Palestinian civilians were killed against about 500 Israeli soldiers. Pillar of Cloud was a smaller interaction, but it's 6 Israelis dead between civilians and soldiers, and about 200 between Palestinians. And then Defensive Edge, worse again. You have 6 Israeli civilians were killed as opposed to 67 Israeli soldiers. So the most of the casualties on the Israeli side were actual military casualties. On the Palestinian side, you have 700 fighters killed as opposed to 1,600 civilians. And that's a pattern that keeps going. And there's some disagreement between the different NGOs. You have the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, which is a Palestinian NGO. You have B'Tselem, which is an Israeli NGO, but principled, and they do seek to do accurate calculations of Palestinian dead. There's some disagreement over exact numbers, so these are all kind of broad numbers I'm giving, but the pattern is quite clear that there's a massively disproportionate number of Palestinians killed over Israelis, but also that Israel kills a massively disproportionate number of civilians as opposed to military targets, something that we're hopefully all very aware of based on what we've been seeing in the news for the last 2 months. And it should be pointed out that the current onslaught in Gaza dwarfs all of these. Operation Cast Lead, for me, was a very formative thing. It's what made me active on Palestine, and it horrified me seeing the numbers rise so much, but it's about 1/10 of the number of lives that have been lost in the last 2 months. It doesn't compare. It's worth pointing out as well, the border march in 2018, another example of Palestinian nonviolent resistance. This was organized in Gaza, where large crowds of Palestinians made a decision to walk towards the border wall, symbolically and literally walking towards the homes which they were expelled from in 1948. And this non-violent protest was met with gunfire, including attacks on journalists and medics, as well as just civilians. So I suppose that kind of gets us, broadly speaking, up to date with today. I don't know how long I was talking there. Hopefully it was around the hour mark. So I'll just do a little bit of a spiel about, sorry, not talking about 2007, about what's been happening since. The purpose of tonight was background as opposed to literally talking about what just happened. So, as I said, on October 7th, Hamas was able to launch an attack on Israel. The scale of destruction that Hamas was able to do in this instance outweighs anything that that Hamas was able to do up until now. It was arguably an opportunistic attack, guessing that maybe that weapons and resources were being diverted to Ukraine so that they might have a historical window to do something like this. Reports of what actually happened when they started to take military bases or land in kibbutzim or that music festival are grim. I don't think there's a question that civilians were killed by Hamas. Although there's a lot of stuff that was put out there that's very kind of hard to prove, and proof has not yet surfaced really. So some of the more horrifying stories about putting babies in ovens and stuff like that, look, if evidence surfaces, I'm more than happy to accept it happened. But it doesn't really it doesn't fit with what you'd imagine would happen on a commando raid. They knew that they couldn't hold territory for long. They knew they would have to get back very quickly. And I imagine that's how it would have played out. Although, as I said, civilians were definitely killed, and I presume that was definitely part of the plan. When Israel issued an official list of the dead a few weeks later, about half of them were military, had military ranks attached to their names. So again, I'm not wishing death on anyone, but there's a complicated picture there. So somewhere between a couple of hundred or maybe 1,200 or something, like, as I said, it varies. Number of Israelis died. Tragically, I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but the number of Palestinians to die since absolutely dwarfs it. I'm not sure what the current death toll is, but we're coming up on 20,000 at this point, and also open calls from the Israeli government for the destruction of Palestine. Some things that were coming from some of the settler communities in the past who produced some of the most virulent elements of the Israeli far right, who, by the way, are in coalition with Netanyahu's government. Ayelet Shaked has been quite outspoken about her wish to eradicate or to push all Palestinians out of Gaza. She was previously famous for saying that the mothers of terrorists should be killed before they give birth to more snakes. She is former Minister for Justice. And as I said, on the other end of the spectrum, I talked about Operation Cast Lead. I said earlier I would talk about the liberal end of Israeli politics, but that liberal government of Ehud Olmert and Tzipi Livni was in particular was a bit of a darling of the West as this Israeli liberal politician. They oversaw Operation Cast Lead. So this is the thing when you have a colonial project, the Overton window of your politics is gradually going to be pushed further and further to the extreme right, where even the more humane minded will start to come out with more with a more brutal culture. Anyway, as far as background goes, it was grim, and spent an hour at it. And I think ultimately my conclusion on this, and I said it's simple, we're just going through the details, is that, two-sentence conclusion or two-sentence summary: Europe treated Jews horribly, and Europe made sure that Jews would pay the price. Europe and America made sure of that. Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any questions or any comments.
Thank you very much, Conall, for doing that for us. It can't be easy at short notice, and to have to go through all of that for us was brilliant. Thank you very, very much. And it really nailed home the history of the region, and made it a lot more clear for people to see that this is a settler colonial project. That's just, it's gotten completely out of hand, as we can see. And yeah, thank you very much for that. Thanks. So we are going to we are going to go back through all of that again in more detail. So we're going to get people in to talk pre-1700s. We'll be people talking about the Nakba specifically, about all the different events that the March of Great Return, all of these events we'll be nailing in specifically on. But that was a really hard thing to do, Colin, actually, was to go through all the historical points and the flashpoints in the history of Palestine. So thank you very much for that. So again, we will have episode 2. Hopefully, well, it'll probably be after Christmas at this stage. We're not sure who we are going to get yet. We still have a few academics, historians in the pipeline waiting to come on. So we're not sure who it is, but we'll let you all know on Instagram and on our Twitter feed who it is and when it is going to be. So thank you very, very much for attending.